U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Besent, a billionaire with deep ties to the Trump administration, recently made headlines during a podcast appearance with Tucker Carlson. In a surprisingly candid moment, he more or less admitted, albeit half-jokingly and with a touch of sarcasm, that it was the United States who blew up the Nord Stream gas pipeline. This wasn't a wild theory or some internet speculation. It came from someone deeply embedded in American power structures, talking casually about an act that, if done by any other country, would be called sabotage or even an act of war. Besent explained that during Trump's first term, the administration had already warned Europe about becoming too dependent on Russian gas. Washington saw this dependency as a direct threat to both U.S. economic interests and geopolitical dominance. Cheap Russian energy allowed Europe, especially Germany, to power its industries at a low cost. That strengthened Europe's economic independence and global competitiveness, something that wasn't necessarily in line with American interests. So when the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, it wasn't a mystery to those in the know. According to this narrative, it was a calculated move to cripple Europe's access to cheap energy and force it to buy more expensive alternatives, especially liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the US. The destruction of the pipeline, then, wasn't just about punishing Russia. It was about keeping Europe in line, reinforcing its dependence on American energy and strategic decisions. This has had major consequences for Europe. With Nord Stream gone, European countries had to scramble to find new sources of energy, often at significantly higher costs. Energy prices surged, inflation rose, and the competitiveness of European industry suffered. It wasn't just a temporary crisis. It triggered a structural shift. Now, Europe is locked into buying LNG on less favorable terms, with little room to maneuvers. All of this benefits U.S. energy producers and helps maintain American control over the global energy market. At the same time, this situation has exposed the deep flaws in European leadership. For decades, European elites have built their policies around integration and submission to U.S.-led structures like NATO and the EU. They've sold the idea that being closely tied to the United States is the best way to guarantee peace and prosperity. But in doing so, they've increasingly moved away from the real interests of their own populations. Now, those choices are catching up with them. The commentary also questions whether institutions like NATO and the EU still serve a useful purpose in today's world. These were organizations born in the context of the Cold War, when the world was divided into two major blocs. But the global landscape has changed. New powers are rising: China, Russia, the BRICS nations, and a new multipolar world is emerging. Yet Europe remains tied to outdated alliances that no longer reflect current realities. Instead of adapting, European governments are clinging to systems that make them more vulnerable and less sovereign. In this light, the destruction of Nord Stream wasn't just about pipelines or gas. It was a symbol of how far Europe has drifted from its own autonomy, how decisions that affect millions of lives are being made elsewhere, in boardrooms and war rooms far from Berlin or Paris. It's about a continent that has slowly allowed itself to be cornered, economically and politically, by the very partners it once trusted most. The final message is a sobering one. Unless Europeans wake up and begin to rethink their position in the world, they risk continuing down a path of decline. The current policy of submission, whether to economic pressures, military alliances, or foreign interests, has weakened Europe. It's led to rising costs, shrinking industry, and a loss of political independence. The call is clear. Europe needs to take back control over its future, stop sacrificing its resources and autonomy, and start acting in line with its own strategic interests. If it doesn't, it won't just be pipelines that get blown up. It'll be the very foundations of European sovereignty.